Boston, America's best sports town. We can debate, and he says hello. Sean, welcome. How are you today, pal? Okay?
I'm well, Chris. How are you? I figured with all the book recommendations I've given you over the years, I might as well get around to writing one.
And I told you the other day, all the books we've been reading, we've had 1 million books we've read. The Tiger book is the book you got to read.
Yeah, I hear great things.
Yeah, he did a good job. And Catane and Benedict did a very, very good job. And you were right on about the Yorkie book. That was an excellent book. I had him on. Nolan did a good job. You scored that superbly. And I've passed the couple next door all around the place, and they love it. So you hit that right on the head. You said it's a good beach read. You were right on the button with that, too. So good for you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'll keep them coming, but as I said, I figured I at least owed it to myself to recommend my own to you this time.
Yeah, indeed. All right, the Boston. Let's do this first, and we'll do the series. America's best sports town, Boston. Now it's debatable, but you give us the Mount Rushmore of all the Boston athletes. You go through all the franchises. They got the colleges. You got the Beanpot hockey. You got the Boston Marathon. Why, in your eyes? Now, New York would argue. Chicago would argue. Why in New York? Why in your St. Louis? Well, they don't have they don't have the basketball, but why in your eyes would you say Boston's the best sports town in America, in a nutshell?
Well, yeah, first, Chris, I mean, you know, the title's a little tongue-in-cheek. We know that all sports, Tip O'Neill used to say all politics is local, all sports is local too. So everybody believes they're in a great sports town and they have the most history and the most tradition and the most championships and all of that. And there are a number of cities, some of which you mentioned, that could certainly lay claim to that. But, really putting on some hat with some objectivity here. When you look at the fact that all four franchises are original franchises to their respective leagues, from the Red Sox being a charter American League team to the Bruins and Celtics being at the very beginning of their respective leagues. And even though the Patriots were not an NFL franchise, they were the very first year of 1960 of the AFL. So there's some tradition here, which not every city can claim. Secondly, when you think about, cornerstone players who transcend their sports, Boston has more than its share. When you think about Babe Ruth starting here, and obviously, his claim to fame is mostly in New York, but he did begin here. And then you move on to the guy I think that is inarguably the greatest hitter of the game is known in Ted Williams. And then think about some, Cy Young and others that have been part of this franchise and Hall of Famers. You look at the Celtics and their tradition. To put it this way, Chris, how good a franchise do you have to be where when you're putting together the town's Mount Rushmore, you can't make the case for Larry Bird to be the Celtics representative because you have to go with Bill Russell and his championship and the way he impacted and affected the game of pro basketball. Bobby Orr from hockey, and now, of course, Tom Brady from the Patriots, which doesn't take into account Gino Cappelletti and John Hanna and some others, and Bruins greats as well, from Eddie Shore to Milt Schmidt to Phil Esposito to Ray Bourque. So a long history of superstars, many of whom kind of transcend their sport and are in the discussion for among the best players to ever play their particular sports, the history and really the success that the town has enjoyed, particularly in the 21st century, with 3 World Series wins by the Red Sox, 5 Super Bowls by the Patriots, and 3 others lost in the last minute. So 8 Super Bowl appearances since February of 2002. NBA championship and another trip to the finals by the Celtics, who still have the most titles of any NBA franchise, and the Bruins winning a cup and playing for another 2 years later. To me, that all adds up to a pretty good case. People are entitled to their own opinion and can debate it, and frankly, that's part of the fun of the book, I hope, that it gets people thinking and start some arguments and friendly debate.
Did you base this on the players and the championships that the franchises have, or do you base this just on the intangible of fan enthusiasm? What do you base it on?
A little bit of both. And look, this is not empirical. It's not like you can add everything up in one column and say that, that Boston has, the number 72 compared to New York at 65 and Chicago at 54. It isn't something that can be necessarily quantified, although As I said, certainly in this century, Boston's run of championship success with all four franchises is unmatched. I know that. We did that. We did that research. Nobody can top the 10 championships in one town in the last 15 or 16 years. Over the course, and then there's the other matter of, when you start counting New York and Chicago, they've got double the franchises in some cases. 2 baseball teams in New York. You've got 2 football, 2 basketball, 2 baseball. At one point, you had 2 others in baseball before they moved. Not to touch a raw nerve there, Chris.
Right.
And 3 hockey teams. So in some cases, you're doing apples and oranges. You've got the Bay Area, which really didn't have any teams until '58, but now has a bunch of multiple teams for the sport. So it's hard, and I wasn't trying to make any sort of definitive statement. As I said, the title's almost a little tongue-in-cheek, and it invites people to agree or disagree, but have some fun with the argument.
All right, now, there are 2 things we'll throw at you and see how you respond. One, they didn't draw well with Russell. We all know about the racial angle that everybody thought was a factor with the Celtics. And the Bruins sold out, and the Celtics didn't. And number 2, nationally, TV ratings are always lower in Boston when their teams are not in a final or a World Series compared to other markets who have a little more interest in what is around them than just necessarily locally. I know St. Louis gets a good baseball rating even if the Cardinals are bad. Boston does not get a good baseball rating for the World Series if the Red Sox are not in it. So that aspect of it, I think, hurts Boston. And, of course, the Russell thing with the Celtics in the 60s. What's your take on those 2 things?
Yeah, look, the first one's a little tougher, and I'll get to the second one about the TV ratings because that's easier to explain. There's no question, and anybody who's lived here for any amount of time and you've visited here enough, that this is an intensely parochial sports town. That if it doesn't happen here, it doesn't register, and so that could be seen as something as a negative by some. That when there isn't a local rooting interest, the interest does drop off. You could also make the argument that it's proof that Boston is intensely loyal and committed to its own teams, sometimes to the detriment of larger sporting events or championship events or big-time events that don't involve a connection to Boston. That much is inarguable. And I, earlier in another life, I used to write a TV, radio, media column, and I was always being told that by people at the networks that the Boston numbers are great if the Celtics or Bruins or Red Sox or Patriots involved, but if they're not, they drop off the table. And that part can't be argued. And as I said, I think it's in many ways, politically, from a sports standpoint, from a social standpoint, it is a intensely parochial area. We are fiercely protective of what goes on here and intensely interested and passionate. But when it doesn't involve us, and particularly when it involves teams from New York, that's a whole different story. So no getting around that. The racism part, which I do touch on certainly in the book, is also sadly part of not just Boston's sports history, but Boston's social fabric, over the last 50, 60 years. And I don't think there's much question that I don't know that people supported the last place or out of the playoff Bruins in the 60s over the Celtics because of race, but I would say the lack of support for the Celtics was rooted, at least somewhat, in racism. And we all know, sadly, some of the stories about what Bill Russell endured while he was, arguably the greatest winning player in the history of team sports, to win 11 championships in 13 years. And still the Celtics could not put them in the Garden the way the Bruins did. And some of that may do with, as I said, I don't think it's a binary choice. I think hockey has, for obvious meteorological reasons, has a deep roots here. It's a popular game at the high school level, in college. That can't be said of a lot of other regions. So hockey has a historical foothold, and I think that explains the Bruins' appeal, even when they weren't very good as a franchise, But there's no getting away from the fact that the Celtics did not draw commensurately with their achievements. And I'm sure it stuns people to look back and see some of that game footage from, the Celtics years in the early 60s or even the late 50s with Cousy and then Russell and Sharman and Jones and all the great players that were part of that dynasty, and to see the building two-thirds full for some of those playoff games. And we don't have to go back into the 60s to find evidence of some ugly racism. There was the incident with Adam Jones at Fenway just a couple of years ago, and sadly, a lot of other players have spoken about anecdotal evidence, their poor experiences with the fans here that are sometimes race-based. That's an ugly stain on the city and its region. And it can't be, pardon the pun, whitewashed.
And they're not the only city that's had that issue. St. Louis is not exactly a mecca of racial tolerance either. So I mean, they're not the only city.
It is. They're not alone in that regard. But I think the fact that something happened as recently as a year ago with Adam Jones,
right? It's a problem.
Not that there was ever a time when racism was acceptable, but certainly as we are in the 21st century, we would like to think that we have moved beyond that. And I don't know that I wouldn't also want to say that it is necessarily representative of the region. I know I don't want to be represented that way. I know that's not how I feel. I know that I have lots of family and friends who don't feel that way. But the fact is those things keep popping up here. And that's something that is a blight on the city and region.
Do you put the media in the mix when you're rating these sports towns? I bring that up because for years and years and years, the Boston Globe was the best sports page in America. So that's why I bring it up, and that includes any paper you want to name. There was not a better sports page. Think of the writers they had in the Boston Globe.
Listen, Chris, you and I are almost exactly the same age. I grew up, just counting the days till Sunday when you could read notes columns from Bob Ryan on the NBA, Peter Gammons on Major League Baseball, Will McDonough on the NFL, read columnists like Ray Fitzgerald and Lee Montville. Their coverage was unmatched. The very notion of Sunday notes columns began at the Boston Globe in the 1970s. And the fact that Bob Ryan and Peter Gammons started on the same day at the Boston Globe in 1968, is a great trivia question and evidence of how lucky this region has been to have people chronicle its teams the way it has. But I would also argue that, taking nothing away from the achievements and the careers of those people that I named, all of whom are heroes of mine and most of whom remain good friends of mine, that part of that was driven by the intense fan interest here, where, papers invested the kind of money to travel and cover and devote the space and resources to have that kind of coverage because fans were so passionate about their sports and wanted that kind of coverage.
And right now, the Mount Rushmore of New England sports historically is probably this, right? Williams, Brady, Orr, and Russell?
Yes, that was my four. A couple of those seem like they're not up for debate. I don't, Eddie Shore obviously is way before both our times, and he was, probably the first superstar the NHL had, and he in many ways transformed the game in his days in the 20s and 30s and had a huge impact going, from coaching in the minor leagues to essentially creating the union in response to some of his issues. So he's one of the 10 most dominant figures in hockey history, but even he does not eclipse Orr and the impact that Bobby had on the game. I mean, Bobby Orr not only changed hockey and how it was played for the way that defensemen joined the play and became offensive performers as well, Chris, but he quite literally is responsible for the construction of a dozen or so municipal skating rinks built because of the surge of interest in hockey in the late 60s when he was at his peak. And he's also responsible essentially for the creation of Channel 38, which was an unknown UHF station in the late 60s that, eager for programming and something to put on the air, purchased the broadcast rights to the Bruins, and because of that became a broadcast powerhouse that later also had the Red Sox and was seen all over New England and in parts of Canada. So that gives you a little glimpse about Orr's influence even 50 years ago, that he was so dominant and so transcendent that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts started building public skating rinks to accommodate the interest in hockey because of Orr, and the creation of a TV network or TV station to cover the Bruins games, which became sort of an early superstation, if you will, kind of like TBS became in the 70s and 80s with the Braves. So that's a little bit of Orr. Williams, again, if Ruth had stayed, who knows how that changes history. But when you look at I know you're as good a student of baseball as anyone, Chris, and you know what Williams achieved, and also the fact that he missed, parts of 4 or 5 other seasons with military duty and how that would have changed his numbers. I think it's inarguable that he would have finished well over 600 home runs, maybe approached 700. His on-base percentage, the batting titles, last guy to hit 400. Not a complete player in the realm of Mays or Aaron or even DiMaggio or some others, but in terms of pure hitter,
he's the best hitter outside of Ruth. He's the best hitter of all time. I can't put him ahead of Ruth, but outside of Ruth, he's the best hitter of all time. No argument.
And and just to finish, to round out the 4, Russell we spoke of, and his the way he changed the center position, with his defensive play, his rebounding, his outlet passes, his selfless play, his ability to beat Chamberlain time after time after time and any other center he went up against for the most part. And Brady, of course, needs no introduction with his 8 Super Bowl visits and 5 championship rings.
Yeah, no doubt. Plus, you've had good media. You had Kirk Gaddy there. You've had Ned Martin there. Johnny Most there. New York's had Martin.
Iconic broadcasters, and to this day, people, Sean McDonough, who began locally and was the Red Sox voice and has gone on to become, a nationally recognized play-by-play guy on a number of different sports. Until recently, the voice of Monday Night Football, still does, basketball and football telecasts nationally. Gowdy certainly is in that realm. And the number of years that some of the broadcasters were associated with this team, or Bob Wilson and Fred Cusick with the Bruins. We've been extraordinarily fortunate to not only be witness to great games and great teams and great stars, but also to have them, as I said, chronicled in the broadcast booth and written about in the newspaper by legends in their respective fields.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. You got a Mount Rushmore in Boston, and Bird's not on it. And I don't know, John Havlicek's not. Bob Cousy is not on that. Phil Esposito is not on that. I mean, the football. Johnny Busey. You don't have a ton of football.
The all-time franchise leading scorer, Milt Schmidt. I mean, you could go on and on. I mean, and I fully understand too that, if you go to another city, I mean, who's the Yankee representative? Well,
it's Ruth.
But it could be in any other city. It could be Gehrig. It could be Mantle. It could be DiMaggio. It could be, it could be Jeter. It could be any number, and yet those guys all take a back seat. So, that's not indigenous necessarily or exclusive to Boston, but I think it's a perfect way to point out how blessed the city has been by its stars when Larry Bird can't lay claim to being the best basketball player.
Well, you got 4. Your 4 better than New York's 4. I mean, the New York 4 would have to be Ruth. I know this sounds crazy. I might put Lawrence Taylor up there. I don't know if we have.
I think, I mean, I guess it depends on your parameters and how you're judging. I mean, based on what he meant, the case could be made for Namath, but I would put Taylor ahead of him as the
I would. I don't know if I put Namath. They only won once. It wasn't that long a period of time.
But it happened to be arguably the most, famous game in NFL history.
Correct.
And led to the merger and established the AFL and. So for impact in terms of, he was the first modern athlete, right? The guy who branded himself as a celebrity, as a guy who endorsed products, who was a who was a star in the truest sense beyond being a great athlete.
And I'm not sure Chicago. We know Jordan. I mean, I guess you put Ernie Banks up there.
Yep. Bobby Hull in hockey.
Yeah, you got to put Bobby Hull. That's right. Forgot about Hull. And the football player, I don't know. You want to go back to Bronco Nagurski? I mean, I don't know where you want to go in football.
Well, how about Walter Payton?
Yeah, you got to put Payton up there. I forgot about him.
Yeah, Butkus is in the conversation, maybe.
Yeah, never won anything, but a great
Right.
player. All right, what other city deserves to even be discussed as having a Mount Rushmore? New York, Chicago. How about Philly? Which four would be in Philly?
Philly, let's see. I guess in basketball, you could have your choice between Chamberlain and Dr. J.
I think you got to have. They don't want to put Wilt there, but it's got to be Wilt. That's one.
Right. In
two.
hockey, it's got to be Bobby Clark.
Pride. Yep. Bernie Perrant would be considered too, but you got to go Bobby Clark. I agree.
Yep.
And in baseball, it has to be Schmidt. I would think. Correct.
Yeah, I would think so.
And then in who do you want to put in?
Some other Phillies. You got Robin Roberts as a pitcher. But the Phillies, as we know,
have been terrible. They've been terrible.
Right. They the 80 championship was the first, and then they went, another 29 years in between without winning. So not a great history there, even though there have been the occasional great player. But I think Schmidt is the guy.
And in football, I don't know who you put in football. I mean, you could put. Think about Chuck Bednarik. You could think about
last two-way guy.
Who's that? Second one?
No, I said they.
Oh, two-way guy, right?
Two-way guy.
Yeah, you could put. I guess you could consider Steven Buren, the running back in the late '40s, who won a couple championships. There's nobody on it
in the modern NFL era. Sort of the post-TV era from '60 on, and I know Bednarik played into that era a little bit, but. You don't have
an eagle.
Well,
you don't have an eagle,
right?
Right.
And the fact that and that's sort of borne out by the fact that they just won their first Super Bowl. I don't think you'd make a case for Donovan McNabb.
No, God no,
once.
God no.
No, Randall Cunningham. They haven't had the great quarterbacks. They haven't had the obvious. Star running back on the level of a Dorsett or Peyton or any of that level. So that's one where they come up short, even though there's a lot of history to football in Philly, but it lacks that obvious individual star that rises above all others.
And L.A. is hard because you could put Koufax.
Well, it's a much shorter when you get out
58
west
right
of the Mississippi. You're talking post expansion, from 58 on, but those teams have been successful enough that you could, to me, it's Koufax in baseball.
Yep.
Basketball gets harder.
Well, because you could pick a million guys. You probably have to pick. It's either Magic or West. I would say
the same.
You take one of the two.
Although Kareem has to be in the conversation. I mean, even though he started in Milwaukee, obviously most of his career was in L.A. So I would put Magic and West 1 and 1A, but Kareem's not far off. That's for sure.
I agree.
When you think about his standing,
you put Gretzky. You might put Gretzky there because he brought the hockey, and then a fourth person, somebody from football. They haven't had a lot of greats. I don't want to go back to Bob Waterfield. I mean, who's their football guy?
Yeah, probably somebody from somebody from those Rams teams in the '60s and '70s. You want to put Deacon? You want to put Deacon Jones there? Deacon Jones, Youngblood, guys like that were that got to be Hall of Famers. But again, Roman Gabriel had a few. You're right.
Here's the overall point. Boston's got the best Mount Rushmore. That's the overall point.
Yeah, I think they may. I think they may, Chris. For the purpose of promoting this book, I'm not about to argue.
Great. We will get you on the Yankees Red Sox next time. I wanted to do the book first, most important. You can get this anywhere you want, correct? You can get this on.
Yeah, you can. It's obviously its appeal is largely regional, Chris. It's a New England book, so I know that throughout New England, both independent bookstores and Barnes and Noble are stocking it in New England. But if you're a transplant and listening on the great Sirius XM across the country, it certainly is available on Amazon.com. It is Pressbox Books, and again, the name is Boston, America's Best Sports Town. And it's available on Amazon and at your local bookseller.
Good job there, Sean. Next time we get Yankees going with you, too. Thanks for a few. Keep up the good work. Appreciate it today.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate the time.
You got it, Sean McAdam, one of my favorites. Good to have you with us. 7 in front of the hour here on Mad Dog.